El Salvador has never seemed very important to anyone. Not a lot of people even know it exists. But that begs the question, how did it get started? People must have known about it before, or it wouldn't even be its own country right now. Which begs another question, who were the first settlers? To answer this, we need to go back in time to when it all began. The first people to show any interest in El Salvador was the Pipo Amerindians, who migrated by foot to El Salvador in the 11th century. They lived there for a long time, until 1524, when the Pedro de Alvarado came to take over. The next to take El Salvador is Spain in 1528. Each of these settlers holds an important role in El Salvador's history, but to show this, we need to learn more about each one. The Pipo Amerindians moved to El Salvador in the 11th century and managed to stay until Pedro de Alvarado came. The Pipo were good warriors, which would help them later on. Pedro de Alvarado was a Spanish soldier who was ruthless and violent. He was cruel to natives and enjoyed a good war. After he defeated the Pipo, he became governor of Guatemala and Honduras. In 1524, Pedro was sent by Spain to take over El Salvador, but he hadn't expected the Pipo to fight so hard. He had to retreat 2 times before he finally defeated them a year later in 1525. With the natives gone, Pedro soon founded El Salvador's capital, San Salvador and Sonsonate. But only 3 years after that, Spain came to take over. In 1540, El Salvador was a Spanish colony.
The country of El Salvador is weak. Streets are overrun with violent gangs and drug traffickers. The country struggles with the 6 million people and tiny landmass. For the large portion of the population, it is very difficult to eat 3 meals a day, and canned beans are now rare for some people. The poverty rate has been very high for the last 3 decades. In 2011, the rate was at 40%. The amounts of people immigrating to other countries are high. This country's government is struggling to help its people. Now the question is, when and how did this country become to be like this? In the 1970s, there was a rising tension in El Salvador. The military-led country since 1931 began to see rebelling among the people. The people started to protest against the military after the government promised better living for the people but miserably failed their own task. The protests started small, but the protests began to grow. The military retaliated. They began killing and injuring people. 30,000 people were killed when there was a protest of laborers, which was a large act of murder and killing. Through all the misery and pain in the time around the 70s, the people had a spiritual leader that led them. This man was Archbishop Monsignor Oscar Romero. He led protests and made speeches for the people of El Salvador. He once made a sermon for the police so that they may stop following the orders of torture and murder. The archbishop was assassinated after becoming too influential for the people. He was killed while celebrating in Mass on March 24, 1980. Today's sermons are great reminders for the Christians' obligation to fight for a just and fair society. After the great archbishop has been murdered, there was a large funeral of 250,000 mourners, and the police attacked again. On that sad day, 42 people were killed and 200 were wounded by police. The takeovers of leftist and guerrilla parties seen in Cuba and Nicaragua had turned out so bad, so that motivated the U.S. to help and stop this fight before it could start in El Salvador. Not just the general level of violence, but also the murders of American citizens affected the relations with the country of El Salvador. Not much later, in the December of 1980, 5 Americans were murdered in El Salvador, and after that the U.S. pulled their aid very briefly pending an investigation. Then in 1981, 2 American landform revisers were killed in the Sheraton Hotel in the capital of El Salvador, San Salvador. Afterwards, the U.S. Congress decided to disperse the aid as improvements in the human rights situation. After the assassinations and mass killings, the people of El Salvador had had enough. In 1981, a large group of people was to fight the government. The group was called the Farabundo Marti Nacional Liberation Front, or the FMLN. The FMLN group was made of 5 leftist guerrilla groups. The first counter to all of the attacks by the government were in 1981. Though some of the attacks failed, they retained a military stronghold. In 1981, France and Mexico called the FMLN a representative political force and started suggesting for a settlement between the two warring factions. There was a massacre known as the El Mozote Massacre, which shocked the people of El Salvador. More than 1,000 people were killed on the day December 11, 1981. The soldiers of the government showed up in a peaceful village of civilians and refugees. They then locked up the people. Then the soldiers tortured and questioned the people. Next morning, the soldiers brought everyone into the square and shot them and moved on to another village after burning the village. Soon after the massacre, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and the aid expectations went up for the government of El Salvador. The Civil War raged on. The Civil War was fueled by the U.S. government and the El Salvadorian government. At least 70,000 people lost their lives from all the air raids and killings. The country's infrastructure crumbled, and it seemed like there was no hope for peace. In 1989, 6 Jesuit priests, a housekeeper, and daughter were killed in El Salvador, which had shocked the whole international community into action. The two sides were having major losses and decided to look into the UN for negotiations. The war on is still tired of this conflict that had been lasting for 12 years. Then the Chapultepec peace agreement was made with the help of the UN. These accords were to let the FMLN surrender their weapons to the UN, and that 102 government officers shall be dismissed. This agreement is now known as one of the most successful agreements that the UN has negotiated. After all of the war, the country had a weak economy and is working back now with FMLN as a leading political party. Like I said earlier, El Salvador is in bits and pieces. Its economy hasn't been strong in a very long time. You can see warnings on federal websites to stay in packs and never wander around at night. Being part of the police force is now one of the most dangerous jobs in the country of El Salvador. The government is almost completely controlled by gangs bribing and threatening the people. Back in the 80s, the people were starting to fall apart and disagree with the military-led government. This disagreement led to a 12-year war ending in 1992. The country was in shambles. The people were devastated after they had been separated with their families. The war in the 80s and the 90s caused all of this poverty. The low amount of money today was caused by the large amount of expenses to buy weapons on both sides. The killings of civilians hit especially hard, hurting the families after 70,000 people had been killed in all at the end of the war. El Salvador has dug itself a hole it is very hard to get out of. The poverty percent was at 40 in 2012. The food prices rose dramatically when an oil crisis occurred, which should change the amounts of exports and income of money. People can barely afford food, and most of the farmland was burnt and destroyed during the war. People are immigrating in large masses to other countries like the U.S. for hopes of a better living. The countries like the U.S. are now donating things like seeds for the people to maybe think about staying so they could plant some food and make a living. But the countries are struggling with the aid and sometimes stopping it. Some companies are taking advantage of this poverty because a foreign mining company lately was mining gold in El Salvador without the permission of El Salvadorian government, since they weren't enough strong to stop the company. The gangs were also taking advantage. They can run the streets and take advantage of a weak police force. There are few main gangs that control over everything with bribes and threats. Same with drug traffickers. The traffickers can move drugs through the country easily. Lately, there have been gang truces created with the government to lower the level of overall violence. The killings were dropped by about 300 in 2012. Lately, El Salvador in the last 3 years has been climbing out of the hole and is coming back.